Welcome to the webinar, Shade Taking and Material Selection for Fixed Aesthetic Cases. This lecture will be presented by Tremaine Watkins, CDT, and we will begin the webinar shortly. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Tremaine Watkins, CDT. He is the NDX Director of Strategic Education. Tremaine Watkins has been working in the dental lab industry for more than 30 years. After graduating with a Bachelor of Arts from Trinity College in Issaquah, Washington as class valedictorian, he has gained extensive experience in all aspects of fixed and removable restorations, with an emphasis on implant-supported and retained restorations. He has also provided clinical support for case planning, troubleshooting, and implant placement. He has trained other technicians in all aspects of dental technology and has written and lectured on several aspects of restorative dentistry. And now I get to say, take it away, Tremaine.
Thank you very much, Jessica. You guys, she does so much heavy lifting to make these things happen. You know, it's so funny when I show up, I just like, we talk for a few minutes and then I do my thing and then I'm all done. But everything that you guys do in terms of getting registered, finding out about the courses, getting your CE, that's all Jessica. So thank you very much, Jessica, for everything you do. It makes a huge difference. All right, so here we go. So tonight we're going to focus on understanding color, taking shades, and selecting all ceramic materials for your aesthetic cases. We're not going to be really talking about treatment planning and case presentation tonight, but we do have some great materials on that through NDX Education, and I'll be doing a talk about that. We'll do a little preview of it at the end of the presentation here, a little bit later in the month. What my goal is for today is when we're done, I'm hoping that each of you has some new tools and kind of some new techniques for getting more consistent results with your shades especially, but just in general with your aesthetic cases. So we got a couple of housekeeping slides on my end too. I am a full-time employee of National Dentex Corporation, so I was paid to do this presentation, but I don't have any other financial support, so any other opinions I render are my own. And there's been no financial contributions from anybody for this other than my employment. These are three resources that I found that are really interesting on shade taking and kind of talking about shade guides, spectrophotometry, and different things like that. If you're interested in those, we can get that information to you. So, and with that, let's kind of talk about taking shades. You know, when we're thinking about a case as dental professionals, there's probably a lot of things that we would think about and we'd say, you know, I wasn't really happy with the contacts on that case, or perhaps the tissue emergence, or different things like that. But if we're a patient, shade becomes very, very important, especially in the aesthetic zone. And, you know, I mean, depends on the patient how big the aesthetic zone is. Some people, it's first molar to first molar. Some people, they literally don't care. But we really, if we get a clinically perfect result, good margins, good fit, all that stuff, and the shade's off, the patient is not going to be very happy. And so we really want to have a process for getting a good result every time with our shades. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. You know, a lot of times if we're doing large aesthetic cases, we get out the shade tabs and we say, which one would you like? You know, those can be kind of easy for shade because we just have to pick something that we can deliver that will look nice for the patient. It's more of a cosmetic consultation really than shade taking as we'll traditionally think about it. But in a lot of situations, it can be quite a bit more difficult. One, and I won't really talk about this anymore, so I want to go into it a little bit at the beginning, is the difference between teeth and restorative materials. These days, the vast majority of restorative materials are monolithic. So the way the shade is created is whatever intrinsic shade is built into the material and a little bit of surface stain. So when the light hits the object, and we'll talk about that in a minute, it just bounces straight back. There's no filtering. As you guys know, natural teeth have enamel that is translucent and may or may not have a little bit of pigmentation to it. And then the dentin, which is usually very chromatic. So the light goes through the enamel, hits the dentin, bounces back, goes back through the enamel, and that's what we see. So that kind of play of light makes it a little bit more challenging, even if we get the shade, to try and get all the optical properties matched. So let's talk about the nature of color. So mass, for instance, is a objective feature of something. So as I'm sitting here in my chair, sadly, I weigh a certain amount. But if I were to be in space, weightless, if you push hard on me, as you know, I'd still hit the wall just as hard, even though I technically seem weightless. But color is different than that. Color isn't an objective thing. Different species, as we know, perceive colors differently. There's been a lot of interesting studies about that. And in different lights, the same object is going to appear to have a different color. That property is called metamerism. One of the things to think about with shade taking is automated shade taking systems. I haven't used every single one, but I have used quite a few, and they're notoriously difficult to use. And part of it is it's hard to capture shades, but part of it is that, let's say that somebody came out with a shade taking machine that was perfect. The problem is that when the patient looks at their tooth, they're not going to hold up the shade taking machine and say, whoa, look at that, it's perfect. They're going to look at it with their eyes. So we need to, I would still say, and I'll reiterate this again later, but the human eye is the best shade taking instrument that we have, partly because it's good at it and partly because that's what we're going to use to evaluate the results. So for your difficult cases, I think you have to figure out a way to take the shades by eye rather than with machinery. And of course, there's a lot of different ways to describe color, but the primary and secondary colors from Newton seem to be the most popular, and they're very helpful in dentistry, so we tend to use this system. Now, this system is considered what's called a subtractive system because the way that, say, this works, I'll use this one because I know the wavelength of it, is when light strikes this area, this particular segment absorbs all the light except the light that's at a wavelength of 700 nanometers, because that is that's the wavelength of primary red. Same thing with the other three primary colors. So then what happens, of course, when you mix two primary colors perfectly equally is you get these secondary colors. And what's most important about these is complementarity. So each primary color has a complementary secondary color. And I will tell you that in dental laboratories, when we're dealing with shade problems, this is like our go-to. Because when you mix two complementary colors, they tend to create a neutral gray. So in effect, they cancel each other out chromatically and just decrease the value a little bit. But when they're right next to each other, they tend to accentuate each other. This is why teeth that are orange tend to look, the incisal looks more translucent than maybe some other shades. But I'll tell you, in the lab, a lot of times we have a little too much yellow in different things. And so most staining glazers have a big old puddle of purple. And you might think, why would I want purple on a tooth? But it's to kind of cancel out any underlying yellow that we're trying to fix. So again, keep in mind, and this is good for you to remember if you're doing direct composites or the like and trying to pick what shades to use, if you use complementary colors on top of each other, they'll tend to cancel each other out, other than they'll decrease the value a little bit. If you use them next to each other, they'll accentuate each other. All right. So let's talk about how we describe color. And this is really important too, because telling your lab, gee, that crown was really ugly or too dark, doesn't give us a lot of information to get the results that you and your patient need. Again, variety of different ways to do this. There's a gentleman named A.H. Munsell that created a formalized way of describing color, breaking it into three components: hue, chroma, and value. And this is my favorite representation of the system here. And it's So the little ring on the outside is the hue, because the hue is whatever color it is. Is it blue, blue-green, green, whatever you see? Our primary and secondary colors we talked about. But within a given family, you can have more or less saturation. So you might have a forest green here, and you might have a lime green here. Chroma or hue is described by what the color is. So blue, let's say. Whereas chroma, you can have high chroma or low chroma. The chroma is the saturation of a given hue. So our forest green would be said to be high in chroma, whereas our lime green or pale green might be said to be low in chroma. And then last but not least, we have the value. And the value is where it would fall on a gray scale between white and black if we took a black and white picture of something. Now, so in our hypothetical situation, let's say the crown didn't match well and we wanted to say that it had more of something than what it needed. So if we looked at it and we said, you know what, it's a little yellower than the adjacent tooth, we might say it's a little bit high in chroma, which is different than too dark. On the other hand, we might look at it and say, man, the color is perfect. It's a little too bright. So in that particular case, we'd say, oh, it's a little bit high in value. So you can see how this becomes a more precise way to communicate shade. Now, obviously, we can take a good picture of it, and we'll talk about that. But it's good to train yourself when you're talking about color to use a system like this. Now, one other thing that's really important. For us humans, we have two kinds of photoreceptors in our eye that we use to see color. And they're rods and cones. To oversimplify, the rods see value and the cones see color. Okay, now here's the interesting thing. We have 100 million rod cells and each one sees value. We only have 6 million cone cells and they're divided into 3 groups, a blue group, a green group, and a red group. So if you might say, compared to any one color, we're 50 times as sensitive to value as we are to chroma or hue. So you're like, again, who cares? The reason is because, and we see this, but our patients are going to see this too. If we miss on value, our patients and us will all see it, because the value is what our eyes are geared to see, if you will. So we're going to want to, as we're talking about this, we're going to want to talk about how can we use a value first shade system, so that way when we're taking our shades, we're paying the most attention to the things that our patients are going to be seeing most readily. It's interesting because I remember one shade miss I had 20 some odd years ago. And what had happened was the patient had a really interesting little yellow characterization on the mesial gingival of one of their centrals. And I wanted to pick it up on my shade map. And I found this shade tab that just matched it perfectly. And I got so focused on that, I totally missed on the value. And I think on the final crown, I actually hit on the little spotty yellow, but kind of who cares? Because the other 95% of the crown was way off. So as I think about that case over the years, I've been like, Tremaine, pay attention to the value. Tremaine, pay attention to the value. So that'd be my lesson. You can learn from my problem and pay more attention to the value. So I have a little slide for each that shows a mismatch. Like we talked about, hue mismatches are pretty rare, but this is a pretty good example. Like, you know, this reddish tooth doesn't look anything like this tooth. And so if you see this, you would describe this as a problem with the hue. This, I feel like, is more common. In this picture, we have a gradation of, it's the same color, if you will, the same hue, but you can see that the intensity gets greater as we go from the patient's right to the patient's left. So if we were comparing this tooth and this tooth, we wouldn't say this tooth is darker. We'd say that number 9 has a little more chroma than number 8. And then here's a value miss. obviously this tooth has very pronounced translucency, and we'll talk about some of the challenges involved in taking these shades. But if we were to describe this, we'd say number 9, the incisal region of the crown is too low in value. And again, we really want to pay attention to that because that's what our patients see. So if this isn't the way we're thinking about shades at this point, this is what I would recommend when we, as a takeaway from this, is every time you go to take a shade, look at the value first. Figure out what's the value. When you're picking shade tabs, look at, does it look bright or dark relative to the tooth before you ask any other questions about it. A lot of times, color characterizations, and we'll talk about how you take a good photo, but color characterizations are easier for us to pick up. So when you're getting to those really precise shades that you want to take, focus on value first. And again, the chroma aspect of the hue is the one that we're most likely to struggle with, so it becomes more important to find a way to do that. Now, because color is not a thing, it's created by the light and the perception, our shade taking environment becomes very important. So the first thing is, like we talked about, primary red is 700 nanometer light. So if I happen to have a light source that didn't emit any 700 nanometer light at all, then I theoretically couldn't see primary red in that environment. Because again, it's not like the thing is glowing red. It's like it reflects that light. So however much of that wavelength of light hits it, that's how much I'll see. So it's really important that when you're taking shades, you want to have basically a color correct bulb. Color correct bulbs are sometimes described by their color rendering index, or CRI. The number after the CRI is how much of the visible light spectrum is emitted. So the visible light spectrum has been measured on a sunny day in the northern hemisphere around noon. I don't remember what it was exactly when it was, but that's 100. And so however much of that your given bulb emits, that's the color rendering index. Most of the time we say that you should have 95 or better in your shade taking environment, wherever that is. Once you get above 95, the bulbs get more expensive. Like 98s and 99s are way more expensive than 95s. So of course, the fuller spectrum, the better. So that's the first thing. The second thing, counterintuitively, is managing the daylight. Because one thing about our eyes is that, and you guys know this from working in the dental field all day, every day, is that our eyes are very delicate instruments. If we get a little bit too little light, all of a sudden everything kind of looks gray to us. And then if we get overwhelming light, we just can't see the details of things. So one of the things that we have to manage in most areas where we're taking shades, different parts of the country, is daylight. Because a little daylight obviously is a great thing. On a good day, you got 100% of your color there, but a lot of times it can be very, very bright. On other days, it can be very, you have a gray, cloudy day and you take shades and everything looks low in value when it comes back. So it's good to have some daylight, but it's better to have an environment that's the same and simulates an average day, because then when your patient goes out into an average day, they'll see a good result. One of the things you can keep in mind about this too, and I've only seen it with a few patients over the years, but I had one patient who was complaining about her crown, and it turns out she was looking at it in a bathroom mirror that had a yellow light. Well, so this was part of the conversation. It's like, okay, well, if you bring me that bulb, then I can make it match in that light, but it's not going to match anywhere else. Because she was, doing the bright light and holding her lip up and all that stuff. So most of the time you won't have to have that discussion. But if you have patients who are very wound up about shade match, then you do need to talk to them about, like, we can get it to match in one light. So pick the light, and we'll make it match there. Sometimes people will sell operative lights and say, hey, this is color correct. I would not recommend using those because they're so powerful. The reflection that you get back is going to kind of overpower your eye, and you probably won't be able to see the details that you need to see. You need to have a good shade taking environment. This picture, I picked it because it is a not good shade taking environment. It's kind of low in value, and with the blue that we have there, I mean, it's pretty, it's relaxing, but shades that are taken in this room in general are going to be lower in value. So when the person gets out of the room, their teeth are going to look kind of gray. So you want to make sure that as much as possible, you're taking the shade in a neutral environment. So that's really important. And then last but not least, you want to make sure that, after all, the main thing is that the patient is getting good lighting. We had one lab where we were having trouble taking our shades, and I realized what we had to do was turn the chair around because just the way the overhead lights were located, we weren't getting a lot of our nice color correct light was hitting the back of the person's head and not shining on their teeth. So we want to make sure that our nice ambient light is hitting the teeth in an appropriate amount and fully. You know, sometimes you might need to retract the lips or something like that because we want to get a good amount of light on the teeth. So you can see that the environment is really, really important because, like we talked about, there's the thing, in this case, the tooth, but what light hits it will change the shade of the tooth. So we want it to be as much like the rest of the world as is humanly possible. So that way the person's tooth will look good in a majority of situations. And then, of course, us as the receptors, we want to make sure we have good ability to perceive. It turns out color blindness, and there are some good tests online for this, is a sex-linked trait. I think it's like 17 to 18% of men are colorblind and like 0.1% of women. So us guys need to kind of do the color blindness tests and make sure that we can see color, because then otherwise we're going to have difficulty taking shade. So the core of taking a really good shade today is taking photos. But one of the things to keep in mind is that photos don't show actual color. In other words, if you take a picture with your phone of an, I don't know, let's say an apple, and then you hold up the camera, the picture that you've taken next to the apple, you're going to see that the color is a little bit different. I mean, and normally it doesn't matter, but when we're taking shades, these kind of details become very important. So what a shade photo shows your laboratory, and you later on, if you want it for records, is relative color. In other words, it shows how one item in the photo relates to another item in the photo. So that's why shade tabs are so important in photos, because when I look at the photo, I can say, okay, if this photo has a 2M1 in it, I know what a 2M1 looks like in the real world. I can get out my 2M1 photo, my 2M1 tab. So then I hold it up and I look at the photo and I say, oh, that tooth has a little bit of translucent. See, right in that area. So I'll hold up my 2M1 tab, and as I'm characterizing that tooth, I'll say, okay, that difference is similar to what I'm seeing in the photo. So the shade tabs are what calibrate the photo. No matter how good a photo you take, it's probably not a good idea to ask your laboratory to match that shade unless you're sure that it looks exactly the same in the photo. And that doesn't even take into account monitor variability and stuff like that. I mean, back in the old days, we used to do monitor calibration and stuff, but I don't think we need to do that. I don't think we really want to do that. Let's just make sure we get a good picture of a shade tab. Now, you might ask, why do I have a picture of this system? Because there are a lot of great systems out there. The reason is because, like we talked about, we're more sensitive to value. And what this is called a value ordered shade system. So everything in this area, everything in this area, they all have the same value. So if you took a black and white picture of all these, it would be the same. The only difference is the hue and chroma. So what you do is you start and you match this one up against the person's tooth. Oh, looks too dark. Move over here. Eventually you find one that kind of pops. And then as you go to the next one, it looks lighter. So you say, okay, on my hypothetical patient, this is a 3. So I know that the shade I want is going to be in the 3 group. This is kind of the more neutral part. This is the more yellow. This is the more red. So it's a really good system for focusing, making you focus on value first. When it first came out, I use this all the time. Now I feel like I can use other shade tabs because it really disciplined me to not make that same mistake and really focus on choosing the value first. Couple other things we want to think about, and this may be your takeaway. So as we all know, as we're doing treatment on our patient, their teeth tend to dehydrate. And usually, in addition to hypercalcifications and stuff like that, a dehydrated tooth tends to be lighter than a fully hydrated tooth. So one of the things I would propose that you could do tomorrow to get better shade results is to take your shades as soon as the patient comes into the office. So I would propose that you have your best shade taker, whoever that is, bring the patient in, seat him in the chair, and take the shade immediately. Because then your crown will match, or whatever restoration you're doing, will match the teeth the way they are the vast majority of the time. That is when their teeth are hydrated. So if you're taking your shades at the end of the procedure, don't be surprised if your crowns tend to be a little bit light because you're matching a lighter shade. One other thing to keep in mind is that your eyes fatigue quickly. So as you're picking shades, if you're having some trouble, kind of look away, look at a nice neutral blue or neutral gray or something like that, and then look back at the tooth and trust your first judgment. The more you do that, the more you'll find that it really is a very accurate thing. I mean, it's kind of like, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I'm used to like, well, if I really want to do it well, I got to really focus on it and pay attention to it and all that stuff. But I find that I get the best results with that. So if you're kind of torn between a couple shades, kind of look away, have them both up there, and then just look at them really quick. And whatever your first thought is, that's usually the best one. Taking shade photos, really, really important. So if you think about what we do, if you send your patient in for a custom shade, essentially this is what we do, is we take a series of very, very accurate photos and maybe do a little bit of mapping that I'll talk about in a minute. But if you can take really good photos, you can get custom shade type results in your own office. So again, the first thing you want to do is get enough light to the teeth, whatever that means in terms of patient positioning, in terms of ambient lighting, daylight, drape, which room you're in. Do it right away before you do any treatment, and make sure you got good light and you can see. That's the first thing. So then the second thing is that you'll want to pick the correct shade tab. Most of the time, I would say if you can get within a half a shade with your tab, that's good enough, because we'll be able to pick up the subtle, we being the laboratory technicians, will be able to pick up the subtle variances in the actual tooth shade. So then, and this is really important, you need to get the plane of the labial surface of the shade tab exactly in line with the plane of the tooth that you're measuring. And it's nicest to put them incisal edge to incisal edge. A lot of times you'll want to have a second person. One person takes the picture and one person holds the tab, because what I've seen with, when I started doing this, we used to use DSLRs for all these photos, and it wasn't as big a deal. But what I've seen with phone cameras is that they tend to be very sensitive to shade tab position. If I get it just a little bit behind the tooth, all of a sudden the value drops on this. Or if I get it a little bit out front, the value becomes much higher. So once I pick the right tab and get it in the right position, I want to start taking my pictures. I would recommend take a lot of pictures. Take about 15 pictures, and unlike this one, make sure you capture the shade tab, the name of the shade tab, like A1, 2M3, whatever, in the photo. either that, or if you can't do that, make sure you you label, when you rename the photo, call it Bobby A1 or Bobby B3 or whatever, so that way you can it'll be easy for the person to know, because it doesn't really help unless we know what the shade is. You want to look for, like, as good a picture as this is, there's still a little bit of reflection in this area. It would be better if the tooth looked more like this to do the shade. So once you've done all your pictures, oh, one other thing, make sure that your camera focuses. One of the things that I did a lot at first when I was taking shade photos with my camera is I get in too close and it'd be blurry. Go ahead and take your photo a little distance back, and then make sure you're at a distance where you can get a really good focus. And then when you send it to the lab, send it at full resolution, and then we can use digital zoom on it. That's one of the things that's kind of counterintuitive. And again, with DSLRs, we just use a macro lens and get right in the person's face. A lot of times you can't do that with your phone. So get as close as you can while still getting really good focus, but the focus is really, really important. So then this'll rock your world the first time you do it. Hold your phone up next to the person and scroll through your photos. You'll be amazed. You just took them, right? You'll be amazed how different those are than what you're seeing in reality. So delete all the photos that don't look like reality. In general, it's best if you can narrow it down to between 2 and 4 photos to send to your laboratory that are good. Because that's the one thing that you have that we don't, is that we'll see all these photos and we're like, okay, well, this one looks okay, and this, but we don't really have reality to compare it to. So comparing it to reality and culling the herd is really important. I've taken to doing that myself when I'm doing custom shades. Is I have a time set aside in the process for deleting the photos that I don't want. Stump shades, not real critical. If you're prepping the case and it looks about like that tooth normally does, then I wouldn't worry about taking a stump shade. You can just say stump shade not discolored or whatever. Because our materials are designed to work with a normal stump. But if you see something that's really dark or really, really light, like, I don't know, some kind of Indo or something like that, that's worth taking a picture of. And mostly it's just so that we know we need to mask it. If you can base out, I mean, it depends on the material you want to use. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if you want to use a more translucent material, if you can get some shade control chair side, either maybe through root bleaching or basing out or something like that, it gives you more materials options. So do keep that in mind. Let's talk about shade mapping. Shade mapping is one of those things that if you want to do it, or if you see something really unusual that you want to call out, feel free. But if my options were either decent pictures and shade maps or awesome pictures and no shade map, I would sooner have the awesome picture. So if you want to do this, this is great. Doesn't hurt anything. Glad to have it. But I would say it's better to focus on getting us a really, really, really accurate photo. I think this is something you're going to use only every once in a while when you have some really odd characterizations you want to point out. Bleaching. I feel like bleaching has gotten to be more of a challenge with shade taking than it ever was. When I was younger, when I got going in this, most bleaching was done, most effective bleaching was done in office. So the patient come in, do some bleaching treatments, we'd wait a couple of weeks, we'd take the shade. It's all good. I mean, and now you have patients that may be bleaching at home. They may or may not tell you about it. There are some people that consider bleaching part of their daily regimen. And then, of course, you get the patients who have bleached and bleached and bleached until their teeth are kind of a light blue color. And you're like, oh. So they got low value with no chroma, which is any of you that have tried to match those kind of teeth, those are the most difficult to match. I feel like the key to managing bleaching today is really clear communication. You can tell your patients, you know, when you bleach your teeth, your natural teeth will change color. And you can kind of talk to them about where they're at in their bleaching process and what might be the result. And then you can tell them any restorations that I make for you, no matter how much you bleach them, they're not going to change at all. So we need to talk about what shade you want to match. Because like if it's somebody who wants to bleach every day, okay, that's fine. But just let them know that for the rest of the life of that restoration, they'll need to bleach every day. And if they choose not to, then the restoration is going to start looking lighter and lighter and lighter. Likewise, if they're like, well, I really need to get this crown done, but I want to do bleaching after, well, let's not do that because we're guaranteed to get a poor result. I think if you're, especially your patients that are very concerned about the cosmetics of their smile, as you inform them, they'll get it. They'll be like, oh, okay, well, I want a really good match. So let's figure out what we need to do and do it. The main thing is you just don't want to have some bleaching going on in the background or some plan that hasn't been discussed and then wind up with an ill-matching restoration just because there wasn't a good conversation about bleaching. I feel like for any small cosmetic cases, a conversation about bleaching is going to be pretty important. Let's talk about a little bit about translucence or even transparence. This is the bane of automated shade taking equipment. Things that are transparent are nearly impossible for automated shade takers to match, and they're kind of difficult for us too. You'll notice on your patients that have a lot of translucency that the drape of their lip becomes really important. If you raise the lip a little bit, it kind of goes away, and all of a sudden as the lip falls down, you'll be like, whoa, there's a lot more there. So you kind of have to figure out what is normal for the person. You know, you might have them, and again, this isn't going to be every patient, but when you have a patient like this, you might want to stand them up in the room and get them kind of under a light and then have them smile for you. Don't manipulate their lip and take that translucent shade at that time. Again, a lot of times when you're dealing with cases like this, you'll want to take two sets of shade photos, one of the body shade and one of the translucence. Do the best you can to find a shade tab that matches. And don't forget that you can really use anything as a shade tab. Just if it's not a standard reference like Vita or Chromoscope or something like that, please, like you can use composite kits, whatever you have, make sure you send that to the laboratory so that then they, again, they'll need to have that so they can look at the photo, look at the shade tab and say, okay, I need to make these changes to my restoration to make it match the tooth. So when we're really trying to get an awesome match, surface texture and tooth structure come into play as well. So let's talk about this briefly. So if you look at this photo here, I mean, this is an amazing match, but part of what makes it amazing is that the texture has been matched really, really well. This, on the other hand, does not look as awesome. And even, this is probably a composite, but even when you look at these two, and this is out of focus a little bit, but the texture is different. So what becomes really important in these situations is that you need to get a really, really good capture. So if you're doing an iOS, make sure there's no holes or voids. So that way, when we look at it, both in design and especially in finalizing, we'll be able to look at the printed model usually and look at our crown and make sure we build in those little details that affect the way the tooth looks. If you're taking a physical impression, make sure that you get light body material over the whole surface of the tooth you're matching. So that way we can see. Stone models are really awesome for this because you can really see all those little details and then you can mirror image them on your crown to get a nicer feature. Make sure too that you, for patients that have very characterized teeth, if they're a little bit self-conscious about it, make sure you talk about that so you know that if you want us to match it or not. Some patients would sooner have a little bit of a smooth look. So note that on the prescription. Characterizations are kind of the same thing. Sometimes you'll have some characterizations that you like this slightly opaque halo feature or mamelons or something like that. If you have some that you like for your larger cases, make sure you call that out. Your laboratory can set preferences for that sort of thing, so that way your teeth look a little more lifelike for you and your patients. On the other hand, if you have patients who have a little chip like this or something, and they're like, I don't like that, I want it straight, or whatever they want, make sure that you talk about the details of their teeth. This is, I think, one of the challenges of shade taking is, let's say, I remember I was doing a case where we were doing number 8, and number 9 was the darkest tooth of the front 6. Everything else was kind of a similar color. And so I had to talk with the patient. I'm like, I have 2 options here. I can match number 9, which will give you really nice symmetry, but it'll tend to make your smile look a little bit darker. Or we can match number 7 in this case, and it will make your smile look brighter, but your other darker tooth is going to really stand out. And in that particular case, we decided to match number 7, and it looked nice. I mean, the person's smile looked lighter, and they like that. And I imagine they probably wound up doing something with number 9 at some point. But we don't want to make our patients self-conscious, but we just want to make sure, as much as possible, we talk to them about, these are your options, and this is what I perceive will happen as you follow these different courses of treatment. What's helpful with that is if they take your good advice, good, they get a better result. If there are neutral choices like what we were talking about, then at least they know what the implications of their decision are. And then if they don't do what you suggest and it comes out not great, they're like, oh, well, I should have listened to the doctor. And next time they'll be more likely to listen to you. So I feel like that kind of communication about shades just really makes things go more smoothly. Enamel cracks are kind of an interesting thing because they have both a texture and a color component. So when you're taking your photos, especially if you want to replicate them, make sure that you take the photos in such a way that it's clear. And then again, the impression or the iOS, you want to make sure you capture the details of that so that we can build that in if it's something that you'd like. I have a couple sample shade map things here. So these are kind of what were taken on a at a custom shaded laboratory. And you can kind of see some guidance. And again, at a laboratory, most of the time, the shade taking person is sort of a specialist, and they're trying to give information for the ceramic team. So it's not that different from you guys taking pictures and trying to share it with us in the laboratory so that we can create what you're seeing. Again, should you do this every day? Probably not. But is it helpful on some cases? Absolutely. So we hit on this a minute ago, optical zoom versus digital zoom. So optical zoom is when the lenses on the camera change the focal length. And so you're getting a picture where the pixels are smaller so that you're getting, so you're zoomed in, but you're getting really high resolution. Digital zoom is when we basically expand the pixels to see more closely. And realistically, like we talked about with cell phones, we don't want to get too hung up on this, but we have to know that we're going to be using some digital zoom to really see the details of the teeth. So make sure that when you send it to your laboratory, you send it at full resolution. Don't compress the resolution, because otherwise it makes it more pixelated and we don't get such a good result. So that's all I wanted to say about shade taking. So let's talk a little bit about materials here. So when we're choosing materials for aesthetic restorations, again, the shade is so important. That's why we started with shade, not materials. So if we don't know how translucent the restoration is, if we don't know if there's any underlying colors we need to block out, we really don't know what material we should use. For aesthetic cases, I would say there really isn't a, oh, we'll do this for all your aesthetic cases and they'll be awesome. because we also need to look at biomechanical factors. If you have a patient who shows evidence of parafunction, you may need to use a stronger material with a compromise that may not have ultimate aesthetics for that particular patient. And again, conversation, night guards, there's a lot of different things you can do, but you need to decide how strong does this need to be. Now, one of the cool things about this is that when I was younger, gold crowns were strong and hand layered veneers were pretty. And so the both ends of the spectrum were really far apart. We'll talk about zirconia and kind of the different modern zirconia compositions, you might say, that really give us the ability to get strong and pretty in one restoration. But you kind of need to evaluate this. It's also worthwhile to have a conversation with your patient. Sometimes you're going to be looking at the case, you're going to be like, I need to use this material. But sometimes you have a couple different options, and what you know about your patient becomes important. Because some of your patients are like, I want it bulletproof, and if it's pretty, that's great too. And other patients are going to be like, they're wound pretty tight. You see some evidence of parafunction, but they're like, it's got to look perfect. And so you may need to use a weaker, more aesthetic restoration for that particular patient, and then have that conversation about, so I'm giving you a really pretty restoration, and you're going to have to take care of it. If you don't, it'll break and it'll have to be replaced. So I think, again, I'm a big fan of patient communication. You'll find if you have listened to very many of my talks, I always hit it, seems like. I think this is really important, again, so that you're both on the same page, and so you're delivering what your patient wants. In the aesthetic zone, it is really, really good to use the same material for all restorations. One of the sneaky things about taking a case from the model or from the laboratory to the mouth is that I can have two dissimilar materials right next to each other that look really good on the model and even just sitting on the bench. But when I get them in the mouth, because of the interplay of light and shadows and different things like that, they start to look subtly different, especially in the value. So, and then of course, when we get patients with high smile lines, it becomes even a greater challenge. So I would say whenever possible, we want to do the same materials right next to each other. We'll talk about zirconia bonding and how that has kind of made that a little bit better. And then not too many years ago, I'd say maybe 7 or 8 years ago, if you wanted to get a really nice looking zirconia restoration, you needed to layer it, at least labially. But now we have restorations that really look very pretty and variegated with a monolithic. So I feel like layered isn't as critical even as it was just a few years ago. And like I said, now we have things that are strong and pretty. But really, talking about aesthetic materials, we really only have two options. Zirconia, but that's a pretty big topic now. And then lithium silicate or lithium disilicate. I kind of use the zirconia as the strong end of the spectrum and the lithium products as the pretty. So there's a few different properties of zirconia that are helpful for you to think about, both for your aesthetic cases and just for all your cases. I like implants, so I had to put my implant picture in there, so bear with me. So let's talk about mold first. So zirconia pucks are often differentiated by how much yttria they have in them. The percentage of yttria is referred to as mole. When they first came out, everything was 3% yttria, which is now called 3 mole. It's very strong, but it's pretty opaque and not a lot of translucence. So a lot of times you actually wind up using it like if you guys remember lava, you wind up using it like a PFM coping, and then you put a bunch of porcelain on the outside of it to make it look pretty. But the strength is really what made it take the dental world by storm. And it's not just that the material is strong. Zirconia has an odd feature called phase shifting. So, and maybe some of you have heard this before, but when you look at a zirconia thing under a microscope, you'll see flaws in the surface, just like everything has. And when something fails, when you study it from a materials perspective, you'll see that whatever crack developed usually propagates from one of those flaws, because the stresses that are applied to the material are focused in the flaws. So here's the funny thing about zirconia. With zirconia, the stresses are focused in the flaws as well. But the crystals on either side, when the force is applied to them, they go through a phase shift. And so they change from tetragonal to monoclinic, which actually makes them a little bit bigger. So in essence, the zirconia is pushing back on the forces that would cause it to fracture. So that's what makes dental zirconia so strong. However, at changing the ratio of yttria in the zirconia seems to affect that. I remember when the first 5 moles came out, they're better now, but we had some early ones, I don't know, number of years ago now, that really didn't seem to have that at all because they were kind of brittle. Modern 5-wise, I haven't seen that as much, but you do want to look at a lot of times the difference in fracture strength, which is kind of how we think of this. You'll also see decreases in fracture toughness. So these are kind of the ways that you can get a puck. So you can see that you can either get materials that are the same Y with different levels of translucence layered into it, or you can get multi-Y pucks. So again, different labs will have different ways that they like to do things, but this is a good conversation to have with your laboratory. Like, how do we have, what's your best solution for aesthetics in a given situation? What are the trade-offs between strengths and aesthetics? And we'll talk about kind of a good way to go about systematizing that. Another thing that's become a huge thing in the world of aesthetics is zirconia bonding. Not so many years ago, we wound up having to do either Empress or lithium silicate, lithium disilicate, because we could etch it. And so it would allow us to adhesively cement it, and thus we could do partial coverage restorations. Now that we have MDP-based primers, we can bond zirconia predictably. And this has become a very regular part of a lot of practices. So there's a couple things you need to keep in mind with zirconia priming. The first thing is that everything else that you bond uses the silica groups in the material for bonding. Well, zirconia doesn't have any silica in it. So what bonds in zirconia is the phosphate groups. So the problem is oral fluids also stick to those phosphate groups and can inhibit the bonding. So if you do need to bond to zirconia, make sure you use some kind of chemical cleaning process like this first, then apply your primer, then use a dual cure resin. It's hard to be, most zirconia is fairly opaque, even the more translucent materials. So it's probably better to use a dual cure so you can be sure that you'll get a full cure on your material. What's cool about this is that it gives you the ability to, like we talked about, let's say you're doing a crown on 8 and a veneer on 9. Allows you to use the same materials as opposed to trying to do maybe a layered on 8 to match an Emax on 9 or something like that. Like we talked about, layered zirconia, still, I think it still has a place. I mean, they do look really, really nice. One of the things, and you don't hear so much about it anymore, but a few years ago, people were talking about, oh, layered zirconia, it always cracks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what had happened was some of us laboratories, zirconia was the first non-metal substrate that we were all working with. I mean, there was, you know, even foil veneers and things like that. A lot of times we just use PFM porcelain with no M behind it. So I think some laboratories thought, porcelain's porcelain, I'll just slap some porcelain on there. But once we got through that, Zirconia is an excellent substrate for applying porcelain, because one of the things, for those of you that are familiar with putting porcelain on metal, is that the coefficient of thermal expansion of the substrate needs to be just a little bit lower. Boy, I haven't looked at this for a long time. This is ad-libbing. Than the material, the ceramic material, so that, because what we want is we want slight compression between the ceramic and the substrate in the case of a metal. Zirconia is always the same. It's very, very predictable. So you always know exactly what a CTE you're going to have, so you know what you have to do to get good compression. What's the word I'm looking for? To get that compression that helps prevent fracturing. The other thing is that, metal lingual behind a central tends to gray out the incisal, not so much with the zirconia. So we can definitely do, especially on the maxilla, sometimes you can do labial layering. And you'll see this even sometimes with all on X type cases, in addition to crown and bridge. So I think for those of you that have heard that this can be a problem, I think that's kind of straw man. I don't think that's a real thing. They're more expensive, and I don't know that you're going to use them every day. But if you do have situations where you need to match a existing restoration that's got some layering ceramic on it, or if you need to, or if you do need to use dissimilar materials, in general, the ceramics that are layered on zirconia are a little bit different than the ones that are used with PFMs, and they tend to match nicely with the lithium silicate, lithium disilicate. So if you are doing those two materials next to each other, this can be helpful to get similar translucencies and the like. Likewise, most zirconia will block out those dark stumps that you're dealing with. So this can be a way to get a nice single tooth that blocks out a stump and yet has nice translucency, as opposed to trying to find a translucent material that's translucent enough to look nice, but doesn't get messed up by the underlying dentition. Oh, one other little tip on cements I was going to say. The cement gap on most restorations is very, very small. Realistically, you're not going to be able to make if the crown doesn't match, you're not going to be able to make a measurable difference with your cement. So I would recommend using clear cement all the time, because that'll give you, it just makes your process more predictable. And if the shade doesn't match, then take some nice pictures for us and we'll straighten it out for you, as opposed to trying to mess around with it. And, you put a bright yellow cement in there. If you want a little more chroma, and you're like, well, that didn't do very much. And sometimes, because of milling and different things like that, the cement gap inside the crown can be uneven. So if you were able to use a chromatic cement and make some difference, it's going to be uneven, the amount of difference. And a lot of times this area in the coping tends to have a little more space. So that's usually exactly where you don't want a lot of chroma to show up. So I think this is a good tool to have in your toolbox. You're going to do it every day? Probably not, but it, for the right cases, it can be really helpful. So I'm sure you have things that you use in your practice that work great for you. And when you talk to your colleagues, they're like, what? I hate that thing. I mean, there's a lot of touch in what we do. And it's not different with dental laboratories. If you ask 5 different technicians or laboratories what their favorite zirconia is, you'll probably get 5 different answers. So what I would recommend when you're working with your laboratory and you want to prepare yourself to handle these kind of aesthetic cases is don't start practicing on an aesthetic case. What I would do is talk to your laboratory and say, hey, what options do you have in zirconia? And then take some cases that aren't necessarily high aesthetic cases, but go ahead and take your set of photos that you normally take and sample all the different materials. Because it's not only what your lab thinks about it, but how it works, how they look in your practice. So it's really good to have an idea of, hey, when I order The high translucent anterior zirconia, I really like it for this. I don't like it as much for that. So and then once you've worked through it, you're like, okay, now I know what my tools are in my toolbox. So when a patient comes in and you're ready to do one of those more cosmetically demanding cases, you kind of have your favorite materials picked out. And then if you try all of them and you're like, none of these are really what I want, then I think the next thing is to kind of make an appointment and talk to your laboratory and say, I've tried all these different materials and I'm just not seeing fill in the blank, translucence or shade control, or they look a little bit milky or whatever it is, and kind of talk through it. Because your lab may be able to help you find something that is going to get the result that you want and still not compromise the strength and the other things that your laboratory looks at when they're picking materials for your cases. So I really recommend try it before you need it. I think that's really important. It'll make your life a lot easier. Lithium silicate disilicate restorations are awesome for aesthetics. Till recently, they were really your only option anytime you had to do a bonded restoration. And they can be, of course, monolithic, they can be micro-layered, and there's so many different options for these. Now, one of the things, some clinicians like to select the ingots themselves, and they might select an MT or even an HT. Keep in mind that there is a value penalty for going to an HT. I always thought, well, when these first again came out a long time ago, I was like, well, I want translucent crowns, so I'm going to use HT. And so my B1s were looking like D2s, and I'm like, what the heck? What happened here? It's like, oh yeah, it's translucent, so it tends to be lower in value. So it's best to kind of, again, let your laboratory, you take the photos, you show exactly what you need in those 2 to 4 perfect photos, and then let your laboratory pick the material that's going to work best. So again, if there are situations where you need to or want to use a lithium silicate disilicate type veneer, you'll probably, if you're doing a bridge or something like that next door, you may want to consider a layered restoration, because even with the really pretty zirconias, they're going to tend to be, it'll be close, but they're going to tend to be a little bit higher in value than the lithium silicate. These have ingots that are designed for shade control, but the pretty ones don't have as much shade control. So like we were talking about in terms of doing in-office shade control, I think it's really important, if you want to use one of these more translucent restorative materials, make sure that you manage the stump, and that's not cement. Again, dark stumps I would still cement with clear cement, but we just need to make sure we have a strategy to get them under control. For your patients that want the prettiest thing that they can get, I would say this is it today, in my opinion. So what's next? What do you take from this to have things better at your practice? So the first thing is, you don't want to wait until, I like that saying, don't let perfect be the enemy of better. We were doing some Kaizens in some of our laboratories to try and improve things. And so we bring a whole bunch of experts together and we'd say, how can we make this process better? And then we do it. And I kind of tend to be the person who likes to mess around with it until I think I found the perfect solution and then implement it. And I think that's been a limiting thing for me, and it could be a limiting thing for you as you're doing this. So if you want to revamp your whole process, that's great. But if not, maybe what you decide to do is, tomorrow, I'm going to start taking the shade as soon as the patient arrives. Do something so that you get better results. Again, we've talked a lot about communication with your laboratory, communication with your patients. I think that's something else that you can do. I would also say kind of sampling the aesthetic options that your laboratory has for you and getting a good sense of, when I'm doing this kind of case, this is what I want. When I'm doing a shade control case, this is what I want. When I have a lot of translucency, this is what I want. Figure it out ahead of time so that way you have a plan. And speaking of treatment planning, when you're dealing with cases where you have implants, misaligned teeth, dark stumps, talking with a patient, working with potentially a team of specialists, talking with your laboratory is going to be the key to the whole process. I mean, obviously, we're talking just about shaded materials now, but gingival emergence obviously is a factor, and different aspects of contour and things like that. You're going to want to have a plan to get a good solution. For these kind of cases, usually number 9 crown is not going to get you what you need. Photos, very, very important, but also look at the case holistically and make sure, have I set myself up for success on this case? One of the things that can be really helpful with the more comprehensive cases of the patients that are really focused on this, let's say, is to get them to a mock-up early. So for some patients where it's mostly contour, it's doing a digital smile design and showing them what that looks like. For other patients, it might be doing some kind of snap-on smile or something like that. You don't necessarily want to do something, you want to do something that's reversible, but the more you can let them see, you know, I remember all those diagnostic wax-ups I've done over the years. It's like patient looks at it and I'm like, cool. But it doesn't have anything to do with them. Letting them see it in their face in a photo or in one of your treatment simulations in your software, or letting them see it in a mock-up even, makes a big difference. And we've kind of talked about, basically this whole thing is about how can you get your laboratory the information they need to get
Tremaine, we lost audio. Want to try the mute, unmute?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry. I don't know what's going on with that. Oh, so anyhow, back on track here. So like we talked about, getting good information in your laboratory, but also communicating about difficulties of specific cases and planning ahead of time about materials. And like we talked about, working together to make sure that you have good, you understand the options that your laboratory can provide for you, and you got a good assortment of tools to deal with your aesthetic cases. As you use your laboratory as a resource, and as you give your laboratory really good information, you'll be amazed by how nice these cases can come out. You can start getting more cases for your social media, which is, of course, always a good thing.